to
Okay,
continue. Asked me to moderate MIKHAIL ILYIN presentation. As I already told you, Nikolai, that I read and use very much MIKHAIL works in my master thesis, so it's very nice to see personally. So I will very briefly introduce our timetable and introduce MIKHAIL. We have approximately 40-45 minutes for presentation, and then approximately 10 minutes for discussion. So, and I'm now shortly introduce presentation. MIKHAIL. MIKHAIL ILYIN is a professor of the National Research University Higher School of Economics, as well as part-time professor in Moscow State Institute of International Relations. He's also head of the Center on Advanced Methods in Social Science and Humanities of the Institute of Scientific Information on Social Science of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and editor of the yearbook Methods. His research field is political science, with the focus on social movements and discourse analysis. He also did research in geopolitics and comparative politics, and he has been co-founder of the major Russian political science journal Polis in 1991. So his title of presentation is Logonomic System in Multimodal Communication. So the ground is yours, MIKHAIL, and you can also show your slides.
okay, thank you, Andreas. Here are the slides. Let me, yes, here they are. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Can you see the slides?
Yeah, I see at least.
Okay, good. I'm going to speak about logonomic systems. And first, I'd like to explain the character of my enterprise. Actually, the title itself sounds rather dull as a proper lecture. But what I'm going to do is not to make a lecture, not to lecture you anyway. I think that those present here know perfectly well what are logonomic systems, what is multimodal communication, and other things. What I'm going to do is to problematize it, to problematize both logonomic systems and multimodal communication. What is the way of my problematization? What I'm going to do? First of all, I'd like to challenge the people who actually introduced this notion. They are both of them were my good friends, and Bob Hodge still is. Unfortunately, we lost Günther a couple of years ago. When they introduced the notion of logonomic system in their social semiotics more than 30 years ago, their intention was to integrate political studies, actually not just social studies, but more concretely political studies and linguistics. And they were following Michael Halliday in this and introduced the social semiotics. First, I'd like to make acknowledgements. Although I'm going to challenge them, I acknowledge their contribution, and it is very valuable. I think that that was a great scientific achievement, I'd like to mention a few people whom I'm very much indebted in presenting this small piece of research of mine. First of all, I'd like to thank Peter Torup, who he's not with us right now, but he participates in this conference. And I think that his yesterday's presentation is extremely important. I'm going to tell about it, as well as Suren Zalyan, who is absent. a very good colleague of mine, a very good friend of both Günther and Bob, and he actually wrote a few pieces commenting the whole idea of social semiotics, as well as in one of his articles, he also mentioned extremely important thing that it was Yuri Lotman who first used this notion, social semiotics, but actually his interpretation of social semiotics was very close to the one which was presented yesterday by Peter Torup, which is an idea of a cultural semiotics, understanding culture, of course, in a very broad sense, which includes also all social aspects. Peter yesterday introduced a number of things. In case we have time, I'd like to comment because they are very resonant with what I'm going to tell now. But my gratitude also goes to Ivan Fomin, who is actually here in this group. And he's present at this meeting. And I'd like to tell you a story. In November of 2019, I think, Vanya, it was our last joint visit to a conference, offline visit to an actual conference of Association of Interdisciplinary Studies in Amsterdam. And when we were leaving Amsterdam, just at the border checkpoint in the airport, I just noticed that Ivan started to make photos. I immediately asked him, Vanya, what are you doing? And he said, wow, I'm making photo of logonomic system. And if you look at this picture, you could see this gentleman here who is standing with the backpack and so on. That's me. So Vanya was making this picture, and I'm proud to be in this picture. And this picture is actually what is a best, one of the best expressions of what logonomic systems are, according to Günther and Bob. So if you could see here that it's multimodal, there are inscriptions, there are rails, there are people standing who are making comments and so on, and there are directions, and everybody knows the rules, and everybody follows those rules. And not only verbally, reacting not only verbally, but bodily and in all other ways. So that's what makes logonomic system multimodal, and that's what makes it functional and meaningful. So, so this model was created by Kress and Hodge, and respective models were created by Yuri Lotman. They are pansemiotic ones. They overarch communication or language within broadly defined society and culture. Of course, it was very natural that they did it because they followed Charles Morris, who was also a pansemiotic, who claimed that semiotics penetrates everything. And I think that you would agree with that. I think that that's undeniable to a semiotician with a broad background. And from this point of view, it was only natural to interpret logonomic system as something organized through integration of different modes of communication. And that far is my lecture. So here I stop with my lecture. And what I'm going to continue is to do something different. to challenge this fantastic, this seminal scientific achievement. That doesn't mean that challenging scientific achievement, I would negate it. No, I'm going to give a different interpretation, and I'm going to introduce different perspectives than those that were used by its creators. So that's how my today's enterprise started. I want to try to turn inside, or rather bottom up, our accustomed patterns of imagination and thinking. So if you follow Günther and Bob, if you follow Yuri Lotman, you would be using those familiar approaches. So I like to ask you to use somewhat different approaches that are opposite, which are mirror-like to those used by its creators. But before that, let me show you some pictures. On those pictures, we can see our Anthropocene world, today's world. So what you see on these pictures, here you could see the room of United Nations down here. You could see a railway station. You could see a military parade. You could see a busy street with heavy traffic. You could see a demonstration. You could see notices on the streets. You can see a memorial, Hiroshima Dome. And you can see those renowned images carved in the mountains, depicting American presidents. So what is common in all those pictures? They are all multimodal. They are all logonomic. They all help us to orient in this world and to organize this world and to understand this world and to interpret this world. So our Anthropocene world is managed by ourselves. We make it Anthropocene, we make it human, because it is semiotized, because it is all those logonomic systems are implanted here. So Vanya could well make pictures like that as well. Not just remember Amsterdam airport. So Amsterdam airport could be here, as well as this this busy street with traffic also could be here. Naturally, it's here. Why? Because the pedestrians and drivers, they follow certain rules. There are indications. Sometimes there are signs with certain inscriptions. Sometimes there are icons. Sometimes there are some curves and shapes which could be interpreted by the drivers accordingly. They could see in the curves of the street, and they can read messages, and they can follow those rules, or they can violate those rules. And of course, they could understand that if they violate those rules, they could be penalized. Same is true about all other pictures. All other pictures. The Hiroshima Dome, of course, is not just a thing, just a piece of concrete stuff. It creates lots of images. It has its own message, and so on and so forth. Same is true about this. Those portraits of American presidents, the sculpture portraits of American presidents. Okay, if you are an American, or if you are even shallowly educated, you would recognize the faces. Even if you saw sometimes a dollar bill, you would recognize a famous face, yeah? But even if you are not educated, even if you never saw dollar in your life, you could interpret it somehow. It still is a very distorted, a very limited, but logonomic system that would allow you to interpret it, for example, as spirits of the mountains, or something like that. Of course, it's absolutely unbelievable that somebody would interpret it as a contingent creation of natural forces. Absolutely impossible, because everybody would recognize that this is a semiotic system, and there's something behind it. It's not creation of nature. So after this introduction, I would like to stress again that we live in the world that is so heavily semiotized that we take for granted existence of logonomic systems, existing of very diversified logonomic systems, and habituation of them. They were habituated, and Vanya today is going to speak in the next session. He's going to speak about habituation and logonomization. And I think he would further elaborate in a much more subtle way some points which I would just mention here. I would like to suggest that from this perspective of overarching top-down vision of logonomic system, we turn to all-embracing bottom-up vision of logonomic system. I suggest you to imagine what this world was when we had no language, when we had no industry, when we had no abilities to carve stones and make memorials. When we, I mean our ancestors, were just starting or about to start their human existence. I'm going to speak about early hominids and try to ask you, where those early hominids had anything to do with the world. Imagine what the world is. Try to imagine whether they could find around anything similar, if not similar, functionally equivalent. That would be a better expression. Could they find something functionally equivalent in their world? And you see this world on those pictures down, which can help them to exist as those logonomic semiotized systems help us to do. To move around, to make good living, to survive, just to survive. Because their main concern was survival, naturally. So to survive and to create decent conditions for further existence. Was there something like that? Of course, there are no railways, no roads, no artifacts. What they can use, they can just use their bodies, and they can just use natural objects like sticks, stone, leaves, grass, I don't know what, whatever they can find around. So at their disposal are very limited possibilities. Not all those fantastic instruments that we are using to semiotize this world, to make it meaningful. Very limited possibilities, just body and just occasional objects. So my question then is, how can we look for anything equivalent to logonomic systems? And here I have assistance. And this assistance is provided by Terence Deacon. He wrote a fantastic book, which is called Incomplete Nature. And its subtitle is How Mind Emerged from Matter. And this is a very big enterprise. Mine enterprise is much smaller. So I would like to ask a question. How logonomic system emerged from natural conditions of hominin living? I would try to make the question more precise and focused on semiotics. How the semiotics we actually use now emerged from what we think was primeval communication without any semiotic makeup. Of course, our ancestors communicated somehow. They communicated much in the same way as weavers communicate, ants communicate, other social animals communicate. So they were communicating because they were symbiotic, they were social creatures, so they communicated. But this communication was essentially biologically encoded. So what was the added value? What was a small addition to this biological programming that they managed to do, which made all the difference? Because it was not Anthropocene or Vivacene that weavers created, or ants or whatever. They never created this new geological stage. It were humans that introduced this embryo. So what those ancestors of ours, what they did to start this whole process that would lead to this Anthropocene. So, and my guess would be that solution they found was exactly linked to the main problem. It's like medicine. You use problem. It's like pain. You use pain to do something, to heal yourself. You use some other, well, substances or whatever to do something different. So it was much the same reaction, a very natural one. So people were our ancestors. They were constrained. They were not in a very favorable world. Climate, living conditions, access to resources, unfavorable. But there was something quite bearable, even probably sometimes enjoyable in those surroundings. And those creatures, as well as any animal, and we know that from Uexküll already, any animal has what he calls Umwelt. So animal is not just only a body. Animals are not only populations, or they are not only species, and they are not only bodies. They all have what Uexküll called Umwelt. They have the world around, which is controlled by them, which is, if not controlled, probably that's too strong a word, which they are in contact with through exchange of information. There's an exchange of information with environment. And these flows of information, they create Umwelt. So the bodies actually exist, and they actually manage to survive, and they manage to gain better conditions for their living, utilizing those Umwelts. And what I'm going to draw your attention to is that not a single organism of those human ancestors of ours was able to utilize this Umwelt on his or her own. they were utilizing this collectively, and they were utilizing it in their populations, in their packs. Of course, it was a very rudimentary communication. But since they were doing this collectively, it was possible for each member of a pack to adequately relate to the same constraints, because they were sharing constraints. They were sharing constraints not only physically, but they were sharing those constraints through information flows. And this double reflection of constraints made a very important possibility. So far, being a social animal, they were subjects to those constraints. They just had no choice to do, but just to follow those constraints. Like we follow, for example, traffic rules. But we follow traffic rules consciously. We ourselves created those traffic rules. But those ancestors of ours, they were following, in inverted commas, traffic rules that were not created by them. They were created by the outside world. So the great achievement and the beginning of the whole history of our humankind, and the beginning of Anthropocene, actually, in a way, of anthropogenesis, it all depended on this small discovery that what they can do is to utilize this division of physical constraints and constraints and informational constraints. Since informational constraints double physical constraints, and if you can control your informational constraints, you can also control your physical constraints. So the point was how to control informational constraints. So my answer is by interiorization. So they interiorized what we would now call contexts, and it could be said that they contextualized physical constraints, which are physical contexts. Of course, they were not contexts because there were no texts. That's why I'm using this word constraint. And contexts are constraints too, but of a different kind. They're semiotic constraints. So it was possible to interiorize them and to create copy of constraints, your own copy, the copy you are master of, the copy with which you can work, you can imagine, you can memorize, you can communicate to other people, your memories and your expectations. Of course, it was not communicated at this early stage by means of language. There were no languages. Probably there was body language, if we can call it like this. There was body language coupled with some vocal support. Multimodal thing, by the way. And that's the beginning of multimodality. But for those creatures, it wasn't something integrated. On the opposite, it was something not yet specialized. All those modes were not yet existing. They were still in the conditions of primeval totality. So the whole thing consisted in a very heavy work of controlling constraints. So that's how it all started. You had to control those constraints. Constraints were mentalized and thus controlled. They gradually attained semiotic properties through what? Through communication practices. And to better organize communication, you had to adopt habits. And that's what Vanya is going to tell us about in the next section. And not just habits, many other things. Of course, there appeared signs. There appeared the whole combination of signs. There appeared semiotic systems. First, they developed semiotic practices or semiosis. And through habituation, gradually within this practice, they worked out certain structures, stable structures that could be managed separately and which could be instrumentalized. Those habits can become instruments which you use. Finally, they started to evolve different modes. As long as our vocal practices developed into speech or some rudimentary speech, as long as this rudimentary speech was gradually habituated and there were gradually introduced certain rules and the whole networks of rules, we finally got, for example, Sassurian lung, which was actually beginning of language. From this point of view, for example, there's a great quarrel about within the community of people who are doing studies on the origin of language. Some like Chomsky say that language appeared at one grand moment, probably because of mutation, but that doesn't sound very convincing. But it appeared at some specific moment. Yes, I would agree. Language proper appeared when we got Sassurian lung. But long before Sassurian lung, people were already communicated. And they had fairly developed speech, which was dependent on contexts, on frameworks. Frameworks were existing out there, and people were relying on those frameworks, but they were appropriating frameworks. They were making frameworks into the actual frameworks, the natural frameworks. They were reshaping natural frameworks into instruments which are mentalized, which are interiorized. And that's how gradually lung was added to speech. Same was true about, along with language, there appeared graphic languages, there appeared dances, there appeared lots of other systems, music, lots of other systems of communication. So what I'd like to suggest, and this is about the end of my presentation, I would like to suggest that the way how logonomic systems were introduced and interpreted by Kress, Hodge, Lotman, and others, the way how we all more or less take it for granted is not sufficient. I'm not suggesting to replace it, although I think that elaboration of this perspective, this bottom-up perspective which I was speaking about, is essential. And a lot of research, not just in origin of language of Logonomic or whatever is necessary, but cognitive studies, study of the emergence of art, study of emergence of different practices. I mentioned dances, for example, here, that there are many things that could be parallel, many grand parallel story of semiotizing our behaviors and our ways of living. All this has to be reconstructed to have a proper vision, but even if it is reconstructed, it's not reconstructed, shouldn't be reconstructed simply for the sake of challenging the existing point of view, but supplementing it. Because what those two-way perspectives, they are complementary. So it is necessary to do that so that our top-down interpretation, which we're accustomed to, top-down interpretation with a very subtle logonomic systems, with a very subtle semiotic systems, it's very valuable. It's a great achievement. It's a great achievement of people, and it's a great achievement of semiotic studies. So this achievement has not only to be maintained and further developed, but it has to be supported. And the perspective which I'm suggesting, this perspective of bottom-up approach, bottom-up vision, is absolutely necessary, so that we do not treat multimodal analysis as something very recent, very superfluous, very occasional, and very selective. No. We have to see that it is inherently part of all our existence. All our existence is essentially integral. Without integration, it's total, it's whole, it's holistic. And it is very valuable to see how within this holistic semiotic whole, how different modes emerged, how they were specialized, how, for example, political activities, political actions, political performatives, how they integrate with reasoning, with narratives of all type. There are political performatives and there are ideological narratives, but they go together. And I think that here in this room, there's my postgrad who is actually researching now Brexit. Yaroslav, he's here. And he's researching Brexit exactly from this point of view. So it's very important to understand for his research, for example, that this division into political and linguistic, into cultural and pragmatic and everyday behavior is not something arbitrary. That they are not just things which you have to make an effort to bring together. They are together. The only thing is that they are not only together, but they manage to specialize in some ways. So if we want to better understand their specialization and better use this specialization, we also have to know what is common with them. So this is my message, roughly speaking, and that's what I wanted to convey to you. I want to say that both perspectives are complementary and indispensable. Thank you. I think I did it in 40 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's absolutely correct. So now,
Andreas, shall I put away this presentation or leave it?
Maybe someone would like to ask to show some slides.
Okay.
Slides, you can show them. So my function here just to direct some questions. So is there any question from audience? You're very welcome to ask from Mikhail. Please. just in case I remember that you have to switch off the mute button if you ask.
No questions.
No.
Either this means that it is too convincing, or it is absolutely out of touch.
Give some time.
Doesn't touch any strings of your soul.
I will start then.
Both are quite possible. I don't mind.
Second perspective, bottom up. It's also related, I suppose, this kind of emotional affective term in political science. What do you think about how this kind of affect or emotion can be researched or from semiotic point of view? Next year in Tartu University, visiting Professor Jan Valsiner will be 1 year here, and he deals with cultural semiotic approach of cultural psychology, and he tried to use especially Lotman works to theoretize and conceptualize this kind of affect in semiotic context. He also elaborated the concept of affective semiosis, as you know. Of course, he used also not only Yuri Lotman's works, but also Birth's theory and so on. So, but still, as far I have been in different conferences, they all mention that in political science, this kind of affective aspect have to take account very seriously. But it's still, if we want to research in the level of discourse, for example, it's and at level of the discourse, it's mean also similar to a semiotic approach. How we can approach it? What do you think? Because at least this previous understanding of different kind of semiotic models and semiotics methods very closely related with discourse and linguistic studies. Of course, nowadays we know that this biosemiotic tradition is very strong, and also cognitive semiotics, but some opinion about this kind of questions, because you may probably also mention some student of yours who deal with Brexit from this point of view. Maybe you can comment.
Okay, thank you, Andreas, and I'm very grateful that you draw my attention to this affective aspect of the whole problem. I think that's quite reasonable. Just to give you an example, if you take hardcore political science, you could remember Gabriel Armand, who introduced the notion of political culture. And political culture, he explained it very simply, and I think that his explanation of political culture, which was the initial one and the most I would say, lucid and rational, because further interpretations, they complicated things quite a lot, and it's lost a lot of its meaning. But he said that he defined political culture as a system of orientation to political actions. So we are doing something, and our actions are oriented. They have 3 types of orientations. And the first orientation, the simplest, but the basic one, is affective. So I think that this is quite natural. So you start with something very simple, very natural, very inherent into your body and psyche, which is just affectation, which is a natural reaction. And I think that this is also something which is very natural and going together with bottom-up politics and bottom-up behaviors. Small groups, limited number of individuals having similar emotional reaction, they come together. And that's how it starts. Lucky enough, it doesn't finish here. And it's very important because it goes up. And probably at some stage it reaches very high levels when those instrumentalities which they develop on the way, they become very subtle. And from this point of view, there's another grand notion which has been worked out recently in political science, which is called globalization. Two-way interaction. Global has to come down to local, and local upgrade up to global. They have to meet. They are also complementary and indispensable. There's no globalization as such. There's no local activism as such. They are both limited. They are both counterproductive unless they somehow come together. So it's very similar. The thing is that I'm concentrating on this logonomic systems perspective, but we can take whatever. We can take political culture, we can take big institutional setups, and the logic of this complementarity and indispensability in bringing together different levels of organization is valid there. So.
Thank you. So, other questions from audience?
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Mikhail, for your insightful presentation, wonderful perspectives. Thank you so much for, I particularly interested in the multimodality and the way in modes interact each other, but it is another discussion. What I want to tell you today, Lotman, as all of us know already, introduced the distinction between primary modeling system and secondary modeling systems. After Sebeok proposed another perspectives in order to integrate our biological experience. And I think it's not actually a question, just I want your commentary about this. Maybe this distinction, it's very useful for your perspectives discussed here today with us. How do you think about this?
Absolutely, absolutely. Nikolai, I quite agree with you. I think you just touched the crucial point. You can analyze this whole thing in a different perspective. I was analyzing it in terms of modes and logonomy, but you can analyze it in terms of information flows and signal systems. Of course, multiplication of signal systems and development of different aspects and different levels of those signal systems is crucial. It's crucial. For example, if I were asked by you to participate in the next conference, which you would organize in Bucharest in a couple of years, I would be very happy to give you a presentation on those levels of information flows. This would be extremely productive and helpful. But if you would allow me to make some additional comment, I think there's one extremely important mode and or rather set of modes related to our existence and to semiotic control of constraints is related to our everyday life and to our economic activities. And unfortunately, this is absolutely under-researched. We have a lot of research in language. We have somewhat smaller research, but still quite valuable now in culture. And then everything goes down dramatically. Politics is somewhat better, but of course, quite visibly lagging behind. But about economy. Well, that's a horrible situation. And how can you do with all those economic crises, with those exchange rates, in those flows of money, goods, and so on and so forth, without semiotic analysis? Impossible. And people are not doing that. I mean, economists, they are just ignoring, with a very few exceptions, And semioticians are just not very active as well. I think that's a great domain where a fantastic flow of scientific achievements is just waiting for us. The thing is only to try and use it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Very interesting point of view. Yes, you're right. So let's do it.
Other questions? I can see from chat that Emilia have wrote one questions. Maybe Emilia would like to ask by yourself, or I just read from this chat.
Either way, I mean, I can ask. Thank you for an engaging presentation. This is something that we've considered at a different scale, I think, in multimodal discourse analysis when approaching the analysis of texts or the analysis of interactions. It may be, again, whether we start from the bottom up or whether we start from the top down. And, you know, people have taken either one or the other approach. We haven't really looked at that necessarily in the big scale that you were looking at it from. But again, it seemed to me that if you are looking at that big scale as to how different modes evolve, then do we then necessarily presuppose that we start from a functional orientation and that comes before, say, aesthetic or artistic function, or artistic orientation? That's one question. The other question is that with the bottom-up perspective, when analyzing, say, texts and interactions, one of the challenges, I think, is, and I feel that you possibly touched upon that in your last comment to Nikolai's question, is, you know, stratification, and the fact that these different resources are not stratified the same way, even when we might, some of them we might describe as modes following, let's say, Gunter Kress's definition of modes, which, you know, is different from sort of less abstract, less conventionalized resources. So, yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on?
Okay. Thank you, Emilia, for your questions, for your both questions, and for your comment. Before answering your questions, or reacting rather to your questions, I would like to say that I'm neither oracle nor Pythia to provide you with some eternal truths. I think that in this room particularly, but even in the classroom, I always hate to when my students say that something is right or wrong. I say, no, something is happy or unhappy. I want to say that your questions, or your remarks rather, are very relevant and very timely, because what we are doing here, what I expected to do, and I'm very happy you are just sharing this expectation with me and helping me in a way, and developing my suggestion. I think we are investigating the agenda for our semiotic studies. And what you said about functionalism, I would, and functional approach, I think that's very natural. Even if you look into foundation sources of social semiotics and logonomic systems, it was created within the mental outset of functionalism, because Michael Holliday, who was the the person who inspired this whole
I'm a systemic functional linguist.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
he was creator of those functional grammar and functional linguistics. And he was thinking about language and about communication functionally. And his disciples, both Günther and Bob were his disciples, they continued this. And they this functionalist thinking penetrated their model. And it wasn't done occasionally. I think that whatever is your perspective, top down or bottom up, this functional aspects, they are coming quite naturally. Same is true about the second aspect, about different domains. Some domains are functional, some domains are could probably be better consolidated, also using some other possibilities. But of course, domains are complementary and indispensable in the same way as those two perspectives are. And it's up to us, as Nikolai just indicated to us a set of possibilities. Responding to him, I introduced also another possibility. You entered in and you suggested your own extension and enrichment of this whole agenda. I think that's how we can move. And each of us can develop specific aspects. But then we have to meet at the conferences like that, write collective books, write articles that would be published in the same journals, and gradually integrate those approaches together. That's a very natural way how science develops. Thank you. Emilia.
I saw from chat message that we have to close our meeting, unfortunately, because there are, I don't know, 3 minutes before the 2 o'clock, but it was a direct message from organizers. So thank you very much, Mikhail, for your just a perfect presentation. And hopefully see you next time face to face, not only via email.
Yes, we have to.
Thank you very much all of audience who participate and gave good questions. Thank you very much, and see you again very soon.
Thank you. And I think that some of the points which were discussed at this session would be discussed in the next session, and Ivan with his logonomization and habituation topic would continue this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You are very welcome to participate this next session. Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Good luck.